the goal tonight is to lay out for you a series of questions which we're going to address over the course of the week, questions about the South's past, questions that will help us define the South, questions that will help us answer many pressing problems that we face today, not only as Southerners, but, and sadly, not even only as Americans, but given the global revolutions taking place, really questions and problems as human beings. Things that we not only share with each other in our peculiar Southern relationships, but things that also make us human. And so tonight, I want to lay this out a bit for you graphically. We will show just a few pictures to help you understand the kinds of things that we are addressing, as well as lay out for you kind of a glimpse of the tradition and traditions which we think are worth remembering. And because we think they are worth remembering, we also think they are worth defending. Things which can, we believe, guide our lives today in such a way that would be honorable not only to the past, but honorable to each other. In 2014, the Huffington Post ran an article entitled 9 Maps That Should Absolutely Outrage Southerners. This, I think, typifies the way the American elite, as well as many arbiters of national culture, think about the American South. This is how they understand the American South. They don't call, but at least we should say, at least with this particular writer in 2014, the term American South was not used, and she actually did use the word Southerners. These 9 maps that should absolutely outrage Southerners were clearly examples that this author thought defined Southerners. One map was on obesity. One map was on access to affordable health care. One map was on poverty. One map was on the fact that Southern states have a lower minimum wage than other states. One map, and this was my favorite, which I'm not showing you here, one map actually said that Southerners ought to be outraged because various factors contributed to a less federal tax revenue than other states. Let that sink in just for a second. We should be outraged. Right? Outraged. Absolutely outraged. The goal of this sort of map, this was actually one of the maps depicting these things. The goal here was to define the South not in any other way except by what this particular author and others that are reflected in this piece consider to be most valuable. In other words, what was most valuable to this author is displayed more in what she wrote than anything related to what Southerners actually believe. In short, this study, as brief as it was, of the American South was really a study in this person's own political and social thought. And this is typical of the way scholars have addressed the American South not only in the recent past, but at least for 100 years. Most scholarship on the South, Southern identity, Southern ways, Southern economy, Southern politics, Southern religion, Southern food, Southern accents, Southern social relationships. Most of these studies basically treat the South as something to be placed underneath a microscope. It is something that is unusual, something that is kind of, a little bit odd. In fact, if we think through the way most of popular culture tries to answer the question, what is the South? We get things such as, well, Southerners talk funny. Southerners say funny things at the grocery store. Southerners rarely use the term sody pop. Or if they do say soda pop or soda, it's sody. I grew up thinking everything was a Coke. Coke could be orange. Coke could be purple. Coke could be a lot of different things. So the South is often something that is the butt of national jokes. And Southerners love this. This is one of the things that actually makes them very distinctive. Something that other regions of the country are beginning to finally borrow, even in a day of intense political correctness. More and more regions are realizing, hey, we can make fun of ourselves. So it could be something that we're beginning to share. Had the late bitterness of the past several years not come into play. Southerners love making fun of themselves. We enjoy that. We really do. And it's something that we can look at each other and dwell upon this. And though we are making fun of each other, we know deep down, ain't it good that we can be different? We'll talk more about that throughout the week. For the more sophisticated set in America's purveyors of all things culturally appropriate, the South is useful as a place of fine dining, as a place that the rest of the country can benefit because we know how to eat. That there may be a connection between that map on obesity and the South's dining tradition. That's one thing people will overlook. These two guys, by the way, the Lee brothers, are from Charleston. So the South has like sort of a distinct culinary tradition. For many people, however, in the country and abroad, when they think about Southerners today, they typically think of people who look kind of strange. People who understand that there is more to life than just wearing a suit. And not only is there more to life than just wearing a suit, you can make a lot of money designing the latest trend in fashion. Now, this is quite a few years old. I'm looking around at the audience. About half of this audience is probably too young to remember these guys. The rest of you were too old to watch the TV show. It has reached a point where what others see about the South is something that now takes them aghast. We have reached a point in the early 21st century where for many people, they don't even know what a Southerner is. There are now plenty of articles across mainstream media that ask the question, did you know these people were all Southern? Did you know that there are people in Hollywood who are actually from the South? Frankly, I don't know all of these people, so I think that makes me too old as well. In the eyes of the United States Census Bureau, the South is a distinct region, and it is not only a distinct region that stretches from the plains of western Texas all the way to the Chesapeake and the present-day Delaware. It is a region who, according to the latest census, is populated by people equal in number to New England and the Midwest combined. Let that sink in just for a moment. United States Census Bureau defines the South as the states of the old Confederacy, plus those states that were still considered to be slaveholding states in 1860. That includes Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky. We will pay homage to West Virginia, but of course in 1860, there's just Virginia. So when others take a gander at the South, they think in terms of maps. They think in terms of distinct geographic regions. Now, there are places in the United States where we still think of ourselves in terms of distinct regions. New England, the West. For those of you who have lived in New York City, these distinct regions can be very, very small, right? And still think of themselves as a distinct part of the country. In some of those little small areas, they think they're the only place in the United States. But there are areas of the United States which have this term of a region placed upon it. We don't really know what that is anymore. What is the Midwest? That was not rhetorical. Anybody have any idea what the Midwest is? Right. It no longer seems to make much sense to talk about the Midwest. Is it Iowa? Is it Ohio? Is it Nebraska? I can remember growing up watching late night television, which at the time was just one person, Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson reminded everyone that he was from the Midwest, from Nebraska. No one at the time thought of Nebraska as part of the Midwest. And the same sort of ambiguity exists today. Now, it would be nice if we could think about the South as a distinct region that is separate from the rest of the United States. In other words, our job of studying the South, of answering these important questions, even our job of asking these questions, would be so much easier if the South was the only sub-region of the United States. The map would look something like this. I would rather see Cracker Barrel, but nonetheless. But the map doesn't look like this. Over the past few years, many intellectuals, honest intellectuals, whether they like the South, whether they like their own region, whether they are even vocally advocating any kind of national or regional identity, those who are honest have begun asking important probing questions about what constitutes the different peoples who populate a country of 330 million people. 330 million. Ladies and gentlemen, you are an inhabitant, a resident of one of the largest countries in the world. We're not India, we're not China, we're not Indonesia, but we're on up there, 330 million. And so, increasingly, we're beginning to see surface, mainstream media even, maps like this. Maps which try to come to terms with distinct regional patterns that continue, that persist. Regional patterns that in the minds of America's intelligentsia really should no longer exist. Patterns that should have been swept away long, long ago. And so what I'd like to do in the time that is remaining is to discuss with you just for a moment what I believe makes these people distinct. And it's not Waffle House. The Waffle House is pretty good. I actually do like the Pancake House better. That I call it the Pancake House instead of IHOP. Does that make me a Southerner? Oh, yeah. So, what is it that makes these people unique? First of all, number one, what makes the South the South? Number one is that it is a distinct group of people. A distinct group of people that began gathering together not in 1865, not in Confederate reunions following the Civil War, a distinct group of people that gathered together not beginning in the 20th century, nor is it a distinct group of people that began gathering together in the antebellum period or at Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1787. Instead, it's a group of people that began gathering around the court of Elizabeth I as early as 1585. First and foremost is that it is a distinct group of people who have their origins in England, in the Old World. Now, not everyone came from that Old World, but those who did were by and large not the wealthiest, and even if they came from the wealthiest families of England, they were usually the younger sons and even the younger daughters of those wealthy families. And for those of you who have any sense of history about the way the English ruling elite handled itself in the 16th and 17th and 18th century, you probably know that the younger sons only got the name of the family. That's it. They did not get any money. They did not get any homes. They did not get married off to someone special or someone above themselves. They got their name, and that was it. And so these people immigrated to North America, either as indentured servants or as adventurers. They quickly settled and attempted to eke out as much of a life as they possibly could, with the intention, perhaps, of trying to transplant that gentrified culture of England to the New World. But what I wish to draw for you here is not just a picture of a distinct group of people that we might call poor whites or po whites or more pejoratively poor white trash. Instead, it is a group of people that consisted of important groups. Number one, of course, impoverished laborers across the British Isles, many of whom came from the Celtic fringe areas of the Scottish lowlands, Ireland, especially Northern Ireland, and Wales, and then even into parts of southwestern England. Now, I'm pretty fond of the Welsh variety because that's where my family came from, but nonetheless, that Celtic fringe. But it is also a distinct group of people who did come from that English elite. There were people here who were like that, and I'll mention some of them in a moment. There definitely were people from the English aristocracy, and there were important people from that aristocracy. So you have, on the one hand, those who are impoverished seeking out some place in which they can call their home, and on the other hand, you have those who are of incredible wealth. There is a third group, and they are depicted here, the African slaves. Most slaves in the Colonial South did not come from Africa. Most of those slaves who were not born in North America came from the Caribbean. They had been born in slavery in the Caribbean. They were typically enslaved in places like Barbados and Jamaica. Their ancestors had come to the Caribbean as slaves from Africa. But by and large, most of the slaves coming into North America came from the Caribbean. They play an absolutely indispensable part of what eventually made the South the South. But in addition to the impoverished folks from the Celtic fringe, the elites from the English aristocracy, African slaves primarily from the Caribbean, there's also a group of adventurers and others that played an equally important role. Now, this is obviously a depiction of subsequent colonization of North Carolina and an effort to find the lost colony of Roanoke. But there is another distinct group of people that comprise the original South, and those were the Native Americans. Many different tribes, many different language groups. Some came from an Iroquoian background, others came from distinct other language groups. They are not just scattered across the South, they are inhabiting the South. So all of this together, when we think of the different groups that are going to be comprising the South, impoverished people from the Celtic fringe, the elites from English aristocratic families, Native American tribes, distinct Native American tribes, and by the way, they didn't necessarily like each other. And finally, African slaves. What is important, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to carry anything with you from this understanding of these distinct groups, it's this, because this is different from every other North American colony. The population of each of these groups was not necessarily equal, but it was more evenly distributed than any other region of North America. Roughly, early on, the same percentage of Native Americans inhabiting a colony as those who are going to be from the Celtic fringe inhabiting the backcountry, as those who are from the English aristocracy owning land in the east, those who are enslaved from the Caribbean, and even those who are members of Native American tribes. They roughly have the same demographic weight in the colonial South. That's very different from colonial New England, where most of the Native American population had already perished from disease and intertribal warfare by the time Puritans and Pilgrims and others had landed in Massachusetts Bay. And those that remained were eventually driven out with events like King Philip's War. That is different from Pennsylvania, where you had an even larger mixture of people. We could add Germans to this. We could add different religious groups to this. And so it was a much greater mixture, but much smaller proportions of each mixture. And you could say the same basically for colonial New York. But in the colonial South, just the right balance, just the right mixture, such that colonial Southerners could be said today to be white, black, red. Red, white, and black. That's what the colonial South looked like. That's where the origins of the South today come from. And what is the importance of this? Why is this such a clearly important thing about this? What is it about this sort of mixture of people? And here you can see this was an advertisement placed in a Scottish newspaper trying to get Scots to move to Carolina and form a Scottish colony. They were good Scots, which meant it never went anywhere. And yet, here's all the different groups that I've just described laid out in this advertisement. This is the South. This is what it became. And together, these different groups, red, white, and black, formed something genuinely unique. And I'm not going to go into any kind of great detail about this, except to say that there was intensive borrowing, that there was obviously people are inhabiting this area not by their own choice. But even in those cases and where they are subjugated, there is still intensive borrowing between these different groups. Indian agricultural practices cleared vast tracts of land, making room for plantation agriculture that was first pioneered on English estates, then in Ireland, then in the Caribbean, and eventually in Virginia and Carolina. And yet, in this kind of mixture, we see the growing of Spanish tobacco, which gave these inhabitants the means by which to permanently settle this area. It saved Jamestown in the 16 teens. And eventually, it created a society of enormous wealth, even by the time of the American Revolution. Wealth that some parts of the world had never seen. By the eve of the American Revolution, it can be argued that Charleston, where we are located, was probably the wealthiest area in the Western Hemisphere. You will have an opportunity, if you've never been to Charleston, to see estates that were built on the back of that wealth from the 17th century. That's incredible. But perhaps in the colonial period, the best example of this borrowing and this creation of wealth, even in a situation that would have been undesirable for many who participated in it, was the creation of rice culture in the Carolina Low Country. For the original settlers, men who were born of aristocratic families, who had attempted to become planters in the Caribbean, who saw their own opportunities in places like Barbados quickly come to an end due to overpopulation and crowding. They came to the Carolina Low Country, near Goose Creek to be precise, with the belief that they were going to make fortunes growing, anybody want to guess? Rice. Wrong. Wrong. Sugar. Sugar. They were going to grow wealthy on sugar. Those of you who are from the Carolina Low Country or anywhere in Carolina, how well does sugar grow here? For the Louisiana faction on the front row, you are accustomed to sugar. Not here. Their opportunity was squandered. Their dreams were dashed. Until African rice was grown in a few sparse plantations. The planters themselves had little understanding on how to grow rice, until they leaned upon their African slaves who grew up and understood deeply the African rice culture. It was the African slaves who saved the Carolina planters. And together they fostered an incredible amount of wealth. And there's no doubt that many of them were enslaved. But they created a level of wealth that the world had yet to see. And they created forms of slavery even that the world had never seen. And we'll learn more about that over the course of this week. This is just an example. But what it all boils down to, as I begin to close this presentation, is that the South is different. The South is distinct. That there is a distinct social arrangement, a distinct set of cultures, a distinct set of folkways and habits, that there is, in fact, a distinct way of life. A way of life that is increasingly under attack. And it's not just Southerners who are feeling this. For those of us who have been part of this institute for a generation now, what we're seeing in America today, what I'm now calling the late bitterness, as opposed to the late unpleasantness. For those who complain, for those who suffer, for those who feel offended because things that they cherish most are under attack relentlessly by those who hate it. Welcome to our world, because this is the world that we have experienced for most of our lives. These distinct social arrangements, it can be argued, predated the existence of slavery in the American South. But it certainly grew from the introduction of slavery as well. This distinct set of social arrangements recreated a distinct intellectual tradition. A distinct intellectual tradition that both reflected this culture and at times defended it. And the question we often have is, what is this tradition? When the Abbeville Institute presents itself as defending the Southern tradition, what is that tradition? Are there other traditions in the South that we don't defend? Yeah, there are. We don't defend anything related to the racial hierarchy and stratification that existed in the American South. We've never defended it. We're never going to defend it. But there are elements of the South that we do defend, and we often call this the Jeffersonian conservative tradition. Now, that tradition is not necessarily Southern. It's not necessarily a tradition that began with Southerners. It is a tradition that the South has touched around the world. And in the English-speaking world, as strange as it may be, we could connect the earliest forms of the Southern intellectual tradition to men who never went anywhere in the South. We could connect it, in fact, to men who never visited North America. For example, we could state that John Locke and his patron, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, were a part of this Jeffersonian tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a tradition that is rooted in Lockean natural rights ideas. But it is a tradition that shares a great deal in common with that Lockean intellectual position as well. Not the least of which is that, of course, again, those of you who have never been to this part of the country, this area is the part of the Carolina colony for which the Earl of Shaftesbury was the Lord Proprietor. So we are on Shaftesbury's land, and his protege and private secretary, John Locke, wrote the first constitution for this colony, which never got put into effect. But anyway, we can still pay homage to Locke. What is most likely going to be the case is that when we talk about the Southern intellectual tradition, we begin with men like William Randolph of Virginia, or William Byrd II of North Carolina. We talk about the pioneers, the explorers. We talk about the men and women who first came from Europe and established themselves in the New World. We might even argue that at the very beginning of this Southern Jeffersonian tradition, there was a pattern of resistance, a pattern of resistance that became deeply distinctive about Southern identity. And we'll talk about that over the course of this week. Now, more than likely, the way this pattern of Southern resistance is typically explained, and it should be explained this way, is the resistance of African slaves to the institution of slavery. But there is part of this, another tradition of resistance that included men as widely diverse as Nathaniel Bacon of Virginia, who led an uprising of indentured servants and small planters and farmers in 1676. But But you know what? It can also include someone as seemingly remote as Thomas Hollis Pelham, or Thomas Pelham Hollis, also known as the first Duke of Newcastle. Pelham was in charge of the Southern Department in the British Secretary of State's office for the Hanoverian monarchs. The Southern Department is what supervised the American colonies. Pelham, Newcastle, had such a tact for resistance that he often intentionally appointed governors and other administrators over the American colonies who hated each other. He did so because he realized that if he appointed people who hated each other, they would leave those people alone. Spirit of resistance. Some might say bureaucratic incompetence. But in bureaucratic incompetence, there's a great deal of liberty. The distinct Southern intellectual tradition could also include many members of the clergy, and we'll learn more about the role of Christianity and the role and its important place in the American South over the course of the week. It again could begin with revivalists like George Whitefield, another Englishman, or yet a second Englishman, Charles Wesley, both of whom ministered intensely in the low country of Georgia and even into parts of the Carolinas. Most of us, when we think about the distinct Jeffersonian tradition, we start looking at the Revolutionary period. We are anxious to learn more and to think more about Patrick Henry, about Richard Bland, or even Wiley Jones of North Carolina. It's not all Virginians. This Jeffersonian tradition would not be complete without a mention of Thomas Jefferson. Thank you. Of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. The tradition also includes others who are absolutely critical to the development of this tradition in terms of their public policies, their actions as politicians and statesmen, their understanding of political economy, the laying of the foundations of this tradition in book, article, and speech. And here the three Johns of Virginia are perhaps most important. John Taylor of Caroline, John Tyler, future president, and John Randolph of Roanoke. Just to Randolph South, Randolph represented Southside Virginia, just across the North Carolina border. Not to be missed from this tradition is Nathaniel Macon, who served as Speaker of the House under the Jefferson administration, and the great Carolinian John Caldwell Calhoun, whose father Patrick could also go up on a slide presentation like this as a colonial leader, whose grandfather John Caldwell helped settle an important religious group in Southside Virginia, very close to the area where John Randolph called home. We could describe this intellectual tradition in literary terms and include any host of important writers. It could include men like William Gilmore Simms, the first American intellectual to call himself a conservative in a way that 20th and 21st century Americans could understand. But it is a vast literary tradition that spans all the way to the 20th and 21st century. And it includes such literary figures as John Pendleton Kennedy, Edgar Allan Poe, August Jane Evans Wilson, Johnson J. Hooper, Henry Timrod, Eudora Welty, Ellen Glasgow, Zora Neale Hurston, and a host of other important writers. driven to the margins of politics in the post-war and the postbellum and modern South, this Jeffersonian tradition became increasingly confined to popular culture. And by that I meant it was reflected not in politicians of the 20th century, as much as it was in a number of famous Southerners, including the writers I just mentioned, but everyone from William Faulkner to peasant chefs like Justin Wilson or Paul Prudhomme in Louisiana, to those critical to 20th century music like Elvis Presley, and a large number of the musicians responsible for the Muscle Shoals sound. Intellectually, what remained of the Jeffersonian tradition in the South of the 20th century was best found in the writings of the 12 Southerners. Now, they're not all 12 shown here. The 12 Southerners who published in the 1920s an important statement, "I'll take my stand." The most important of whom were Donald Davidson, Allen Tate, and Andrew Lytle. The tradition of agrarian writers continued well into the 20th century, led by intellectual architects like Richard Weaver, a newspaper editor, James J. Kirkpatrick. But the three perhaps most familiar to us were Emmy Bradford, our own Clyde Wilson, I think they're clapping for Mel, Clyde. I'm sorry. And our own James J. Kibler, Jim Kibler. But the tradition continues. It's still alive, and that's what the Abbeville Institute is all about. With our scholars that you're also going to hear today, and I did not include a slide on Bill Wilson or Phil Lee, but I do have Marshall DeRosa, and then my favorite spooky picture of Don Livingston. Trying to define a tradition always comes at a price. As Michigan conservative intellectual and the man often called the father of modern American conservatism, Russell Kirk, as Russell Kirk used to remind his readers and those who would listen, by the time you define something as a tradition, it has already ceased being very useful. But this tradition is important. It is a tradition that began really by accident, by the unplanned, unexpected arrival and cohabitation of very distinct groups of people. Nowhere else in the Western Hemisphere did such a distinct group of people come together again with relative equal weight and cultural influence. Didn't happen in New France. Didn't happen in the Latin American colonies. It didn't happen in New Spain or in the Portuguese colonies. It didn't happen with the Dutch. It didn't happen with the Swedes. It didn't happen with the Russians. It didn't happen with any of those countries that attempted to colonize the Western Hemisphere. Nor did it happen among those Native American civilizations which were also colonizing parts of North America at the same time. It didn't happen with the Iroquois. But it did happen in the South. As John Calhoun once explained, he did not have the South in mind when he said this. It was really more abstract than that. But as he once explained, government and society are two different things. They depend upon each other. But of the two, society is always the greater. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world that categorically denies that fact. We live in a world where people believe government and society are one and the same. I don't care what you think about government. I don't care what you think about big government, limited government. Forget I even mentioned the word government. We live in a world where people believe politics is everything. And in a world where politics is everything, our lives are nothing. This is a tradition that defends our lives. Let's learn more about it this week. Thank you.